Hey guys, I'm Lizzie. I'm a Catholic YouTuber, and today I'm talking about the sin of gluttony. In the 5th century, in St. Augustine's Confessions, he was the first person to term the word snack food. He was describing people in his time who would binge on salty food so they could drink more beer. The Catholic tradition a century before had already formed a robust theology on gluttony and fasting through several prominent monks. But fasting goes all the way back to the 1st century church. In the earliest Christian document outside of the Bible, the Didache, it describes how the Christians would fast every Wednesday and Friday throughout the entire year. The fast involved not eating any food or drinking any water until one meal at sunset. This came from the Jewish practice of fasting every Monday and Thursday. Clement of Rome, the 4th Pope, in his letter to the Corinthians, writes that fasting is better than prayer. And scholar Everett Ferguson refers to a story in the early church where if Christians saw someone at their church or someone in the community who was hungry and couldn't afford food, they just wouldn't eat for several days and then would use that money to give to the poor. Much of this is completely foreign to us because the Catholic Church today in the West has completely watered down any fasting or substantial theology on gluttony. The exception being the Eastern Rite Catholic churches. In the Western Catholic Church today, there are only 7 fasting days throughout the year: Ash Wednesday, Good Friday, and the Fridays of Lent, where it is required to not eat meat or limit calories. It used to be for over 1,000 years in Christianity where all Catholics went vegan for all of Advent and all of Lent, and went vegan every Wednesday and every Friday ever. It is still this way today in the Eastern Orthodox Church and in many Eastern Catholic churches. Almost 200 days of fasting a year. Now, we only have 7. Prior to the 1960s, it used to be required to give up meat every single Friday. Not even go vegan like the Middle Ages, but just give up meat and you can still eat fish. Now that's optional, and most Catholics don't even do that. And the 1-hour fast we're supposed to do before receiving the Eucharist, that used to be the entire day on Sunday morning. So from Saturday night to Sunday morning, you couldn't eat any food or drink any water until Mass, because they viewed the Eucharist as so sacred. Today, so many people are like, we receive the Eucharist within the last part of Mass, so I can eat food up until 10 minutes before Mass begins. Sound familiar? Christians in the early church and the Middle Ages would be heartbroken if they saw how the Catholic Church was today. Ditching our centuries-long tradition of fasting is a major weakening of Catholicism. We need to bring back traditional fasting to combat gluttony. If we're striving for sainthood, we cannot just blend into mediocrity. In the US today, where we have the standard American diet and many of us are living in an economically privileged position, gluttony is the norm, and because we're surrounded by it, we don't even realize how bad it is. A Bible passage that our culture can completely relate to is Ezekiel 16:49. It details what the sin of Sodom was and why God destroyed their city. This was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. Spending money on extravagant meals and then refusing to feed the poor and hungry is the problem. St. Paul also mentions gluttony in 1 Corinthians 9:26-27. So I do not run aimlessly, nor do I box as though beating the air, but I punish my body and enslave it, so that after proclaiming to others, I myself should not be disqualified. This is talking so vividly about fasting and not getting caught within gluttony in order to spiritually flourish and better serve God. Disclaimers before we get further into the talk. Number 1, gluttony means a lot of things, but it can involve overeating and drinking too much alcohol. I know this can be a very sensitive topic and even triggering to people who have struggled with eating disorders. I myself have struggled with disordered eating in the past, and for a lot of people, it does involve overeating and having binging aspects to it. Whether it is diagnosed as primarily bulimia and binge eating, or I've had friends who go between starving themselves one day or for a week and then the next day or the next week binging on food. This talk is not at all directed towards people who have eating disorders. Second disclaimer, a lot of people struggle with alcoholism, 3 million people a year in the US. We're now at a point in understanding that it is genetic. It's something extremely serious that requires medical treatment, medication, therapy. It's an intensive addiction. So even though binge eating and alcoholism may have the same result and look similar to the sin of gluttony, I would say the majority, if not all the time, when someone has a mental illness, an eating disorder, an addiction, it can't be a mortal sin because there isn't agency involved. They're not freely making the decision. Third disclaimer, some of this talk does have to do with healthy eating and what we're choosing to put in our bodies. As St. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 3:16, our bodies are temples of the living God. That being said, not everyone has that choice to eat healthy. In our country today, there are a lot of food deserts which affect 19 million Americans. Food deserts often correlate with impoverished areas where there are not grocery stores and there is not adequate transportation to get to a grocery store, meaning it's impossible to eat healthy. It's impossible to get to places stocked with produce, fruits and vegetables, and other fresh, healthy food. Food deserts are a huge contributing factor to why rates of obesity are higher in poorer areas and why certain diseases and pre-existing conditions are higher coming from diet or more rampant. So when talking about food specifically, I think that gluttony is a luxury, health is a luxury. So let's get into the talk. 4 main people who I researched who were the most influential Christians going more into the early church talking about gluttony. Number 1 is Evagrius Ponticus in the 4th century. He was an Egyptian Catholic monk and a deacon. We're going to be reading from his book, Refutation. Number 2, St. John Cassian, who lived in the late 4th and 5th century, who was also a Catholic monk. He was born in Eastern Christianity, but then went on to found monasteries in the West, especially in France. We're going to be reading from St. John Cassian's Institutes. Number 3, Pope Gregory the Great lived in the 6th century. He is a doctor of the church, and we're reading from his Book of Morals, which is a commentary on Job, which also happens to go over the 7 deadly sins. Number 4, St. Thomas Aquinas, who doesn't need an introduction. He is in the 13th century, and I'm quoting from the Summa. Gluttony within the 7 deadly sins. St. John Cassian, in chapter 1 of the Institutes, defines gluttony as the pleasure of the palate, and he compares the spiritual battle against gluttony as training for the Olympic Games. At his time, gluttony was the first and foundational deadly sin, meaning it was the least intense of all of them. A century later, Pope Gregory the Great changed the order and made gluttony the 2nd deadly sin, coming right before lust. The order has stuck, and gluttony, understood today, is the least intense deadly sin. Aquinas, quoting Pope Gregory the Great, says in the Summa that gluttony is a sin of the flesh, and because of that, it makes it less culpable and not as bad. That being said, it is grave matter and can become a mortal sin. The other sins of the flesh are sloth and lust. It's important when talking about sin to not form a dualistic view of virtue. St. Augustine's definition of sin in the Enchiridion and City of God is a privation or lack of virtue. Sin isn't just some force on its own, it's the negation of good. So the virtue that matches up with the sin of gluttony is temperance, which can be defined as moderation and self-restraint. Defining gluttony, 5 types. In the Summa, in question 148, Article 6, St. Augustine defines 5 types of gluttony, which he inherited from Pope Gregory. According to Jesuit theologian Father Rickably, here are the English translations to the 5 types of gluttony. As I'm going through this over the next 10 minutes, think to yourself about which ones you relate to the most. Here they are: eating too soon, eating too expensively, eating too much, eating too eagerly, and eating too daintily. For each one, Pope Gregory gives a biblical example to help us understand more. Number 1, eating too soon. This means snacking and eating outside of set meal times. The biblical example that Pope Gregory the Great gives us is King Saul's son, Jonathan, eating honey. In 1 Samuel 14, King Saul and his soldiers are going to battle, and Saul makes an oath that no one will eat until sunset until they've won the war. The soldiers are walking through a forest, and they pass a giant honeycomb over them, and Jonathan eats the honey anyways, even though they will all get fed that evening at dinner. In our culture today, eating too soon manifests in different ways. Many people mindlessly snack just to snack, even if they aren't hungry. A lot of times people are just bored and they go to the fridge impulsively, usually to eat unhealthy calories, things like chips or desserts or candy. People do this out of boredom, but also even sadness and stress. Unnaturally salty or fatty or sugary food is a dopamine hit, and for a lot of people, eating can literally be a way to find happiness and comfort and relief. The problem is that we really should be going to God with what is hurting us and stressing us out through prayer rather than numbing our emotions with food. Another aspect of eating too soon is being so rushed to eat that we don't stop to pray before our meals. I think a common problem too is a lot of people skip breakfast in the morning and instead consume caffeine, which is an appetite suppressant, and then they're hungry at night before bed and are snacking on unhealthy food. So I think a way to combat gluttony in that way is to just eat enough calories at each meal, and then you're not hungry at night before bed. The monks who I read all had a no snacking policy in their monasteries, and that's how they overcame eating too soon. It wasn't even possible for them. Number 2 type of gluttony, eating too expensively and seeking delicacies or extravagance with what you're eating. The biblical example of this that Pope Gregory the Great gives us is the story of the Israelites. God had freed them from slavery through all of the epic plagues against Pharaoh and in the parting of the Red Sea. They are traveling through the desert to the Promised Land. God does this amazing miracle where bread falls from the sky every morning and it meets all of their nutritional needs. Yet they start complaining and grumbling because they think the food isn't good enough, even saying that they'd rather be back in slavery than to have to eat this food. In Numbers 11:46, it says, "The rabble among them had a gluttonous craving, and the Israelites wept again and said, 'If only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we used to eat in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up, and there is nothing at all but this manna to look at.'" In today's world, eating too expensively or extravagantly can involve things like going out to eat a ton, even excessively getting Uber Eats, Postmates, going to a lot of expensive restaurants, or getting $5 Starbucks drinks all the time. Even going out to eat to fast food a lot could lead to gluttony because all of that money super adds up. Basically, with number 2, it all comes down to choosing to cook most of your meals at home from scratch. If we buy all of our ingredients at a grocery store rather than pre-made meals, we're going to save so much money. And we can use that extra money we would have used to go out to eat, to give to nonprofits, helping the poor, and to the church. I've heard people say that they don't know how to cook, and so I think the first step in combating gluttony is teaching yourself how to cook so we can all save money on food. Number 3 type of sin of gluttony is eating too much. So this is pretty straightforward, eating too many calories, but it also means eating too much unhealthy food and not having a balanced diet. Pope Gregory the Great's example of this is the story of Sodom being destroyed, the Ezekiel verse we read at the beginning of the talk. It says, "They had excess of food, but did not aid the poor and needy." St. John Cassian in chapter 6 of the Institutes says that this can involve eating too much unhealthy food, and he says that this can be just as damaging as getting drunk, which is a huge claim. He says that eating unhealthy makes the mind, quote, "weak and uncertain, and robs it of all its power of pure and clear contemplation." He specifically cites eating too much meat as part of eating too much. Eating really fast is also part of eating too much because it takes time for our stomach signals to communicate with our brain. So if we eat rapidly, we'll eat too much. When it comes to unhealthy food, I can think of things like too high of a sodium intake, foods with a lot of high fructose corn syrup, or too much saturated fat, also eating a lot of processed food. This can also mean consuming too many drinks and not just alcohol. It can be drinking hundreds of calories of soda, expensive Starbucks drinks loaded with sugar, and of course also alcohol. So food and drinks, consuming too much of that is number 3. St. John Cassian in chapter 7 of Institutes also says, quote, "It is easier to find men who altogether abstain from the more fattening kinds of foods than men who make a moderate use of what is allowed to our necessities." So he is saying that it might be a good idea to completely cut out addicting dopamine hit type foods because it's too much of a temptation. Number 4, eating too eagerly. Even if we're not overeating and not eating too expensively, we can sin by eating too eagerly and being too excited for food. In Genesis 25, Esau came in from working all day farming and then sees that his brother Jacob made a delicious lentil stew. He was so stoked to eat that he readily gave away his birthright. According to Catholic Encyclopedia New Advent, quote, "It is incontrovertible that to eat or drink for the mere pleasure of the experience and for that exclusively is likewise to commit the sin of gluttony." So if we are mindlessly eating just because it tastes good, that can be a sin. We've all heard the phrase eat to live, and on social media, lots of people make food posts, #food porn. And so all of that, having such a huge enjoyment for food, can lead to gluttony. Primarily, we should eat to fuel our bodies so we can better serve God. And any good taste we get out of it is just an after effect. Number 5 type of gluttony is eating too daintily. So this means being really picky about how our food is prepared and what it tastes like. Pope Gregory the Great's biblical example of this is 1 Samuel chapter 2. Eli the high priest had 2 sons who were gluttons in this way. They're described as scoundrels, and it says, "The sin of the young man was very great in the sight of the Lord." So the high priest and his family would eat the leftovers from the animal sacrifices to God. What the sons did is, instead of just cooking the meat for the sacrifice to God, they selected the parts of the meat that were the most fatty that they really wanted to eat and took them out first, rather than just eating the leftovers of what was sacrificed to God. A modern example of this, we can think of people at restaurants who order food and then complain to the waiter because it wasn't perfectly prepared for them. Or I did this as a child where my mom would make dinner and then I complained about how it tasted and refused to eat it. As adults, we can do the same thing by avoiding certain foods that are healthy for us because we just don't like the taste. Meat is a great example. I personally don't eat meat, but in the past when I did, I would generally try to avoid red meat and only get low fat because it's healthier. So eating daintily can easily become eating unhealthy. I've known people who hate the taste of healthy food who refuse to eat major food groups because of texture and taste, and that also can lead to gluttony. The daintily category could also be people who make healthy food unhealthy by too much oil or too much salt. Something really cool about how our taste buds work, so you can try this next week. If you go an entire week without eating processed sugar and you only eat natural sugar through fruit, after 1 week, your taste buds will completely reset. And then when you eat apples and mango and bananas, it will taste so yummy, like you're eating ice cream or dessert. I generally try to avoid processed food, and so sometimes when I do eat desserts, it's disgusting because my taste receptors are reset, and so fruit just tastes amazing. The same things happen with salt. If you avoid salt for a period of time, afterwards, just eating plain spinach, plain rice, tomatoes, it is an extraordinary flavor. So what I'm getting at for number 5, eating too daintily can mean gravitating away from a healthy diet. So those are the 5 types of gluttony: eating too soon, eating too expensively, eating too much, eating too eagerly, and eating too daintily. Combating gluttony. St. John Cassian recommends overcoming gluttony by fasting, doing vigils, spiritual reading, and frequent compunction of the heart, which can mean a daily examination of conscience. He says that we can trample down all unnecessary desire for food and drink by thinking about heaven and meditating on spiritual things more. In chapter 14 of Institutes, he writes, "For we cannot possibly scorn the gratification of food presented to us unless the mind is fixed on the contemplation of divine things, and is rather entranced with the love of virtue and the delight of things celestial. And so a man will despise all things present as transitory when he has securely fixed his mental gaze on those things which are immovable and eternal, and already contemplates in heart, though still in the flesh, the blessedness of his future life." Practical advice on fasting to help combat gluttony. So right now I'm doing Fiat 90. Who's heard of Fiat 90 or Exodus 90? So it's a 90-day challenge starting in January and ending at Easter, where you do a holy hour every single day. You also do cold showers, no social media, no movies, no TV. But it also has fasting aspects, no snacking, no sweets or desserts, and every Wednesday and Friday, you only eat one meal and don't eat meat, which is similar to that early church fast I talked about at the beginning. What I found doing the challenge and incorporating fasting into my life is that it has majorly decreased my temptation, and the temptations I do have, it's so much easier to overcome. I usually go to confession every 2 to 3 weeks, but since doing Fiat 90, it's once every 2 months because I literally don't have stuff to confess. So here are some ideas of how you can incorporate fasting into your life, not just during a challenge, but throughout the entire year. Number 1, most bare bones, is giving up meat on Friday. Number 2, do the early church fast every Wednesday and Friday, where you don't eat until the sun goes down. If that's too intense, you could also do like the Ash Wednesday and Good Friday fast, where you just eat 1 meal and 2 snacks on Wednesday and Friday. I just think it's so cool being connected to the first generation of Christians where it all began. And it's every Wednesday and Friday because Jesus was betrayed on a Wednesday and he was killed on a Friday. Number 3, you can do the medieval church Orthodox Eastern Catholic fast where you go vegan every Wednesday and Friday. Also, on Wednesday and Friday, you could give up something else like snacking, alcohol, coffee, desserts every Wednesday and Friday. I know for me, after I finish Fiat 90, I'm going to continue a few parts of the fasting on Wednesday and Friday, like no desserts and no snacking, because I really appreciated that in my life. To end, I want to briefly dive into what St. John of the Cross calls spiritual gluttony in the dark night of the soul. That is when we have this great desire for emotional intensity and pleasure in our relationships with God. We want to feel joy, peace, and so much love and emotional intensity. St. John of the Cross says there are people who, quote, will feel and taste God as if he were palpable and accessible to them, not only in communion, but in all their other acts of devotion. He's really intense. He says that this leads to spiritual imperfection and can lead to the greatest evils by just wanting to experience God emotionally more. St. Teresa of Avila talks about a similar concept in The Interior Castle. She wrote about periods of time where we feel in a desert period of our faith, where we have no emotions in our relationship with God. She says that this is completely normal and that it's actually prideful to crave those positive emotions. She says, "Please don't be like this, friends. Embrace the cross that your beloved bore on his shoulders and accept that it is yours also to carry. Let she who is capable of the most intense suffering suffer more intensely for him. Her liberation will be all the more perfect. If God grants you some sweet favor, give heartfelt thanks. This is purely a bonus." It's tempting to think that if God would only grant you internal favors, you would be able to withstand external challenges. His Majesty knows what is best for us. He does not require our opinion on the matter, and in fact, has every right to point out that we don't have any idea what we're asking for. She also says that a vice so many of us have is we are more attracted to sweetness than we are to the cross.